Hello and welcome again to the Lebanon Public Library virtual author visit. Today we are thrilled, excited, chuffed, as the Brits say, to have author Derf Backderf, noted graphic novelist, and he's going to do a presentation on his newest book that talks about Kent State, and we're going to ask some questions later. Derf, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And you have you're going to start off and you're just going to do a little presentation.
Let's just launch into it, right?
Yeah, let's do it.
Let me share screen here. All right, can we see that?
We can.
All right. So as Dylan said, my latest book is about Kent State shootings in 1970. And as every Ohioan, even way down in Cincinnati knows, I mean, this is part of our state DNA. It's a book I've been working on a while. I've had it in my back pocket most of my life, and I'll talk about that in a sec. And it took me 4 years to complete, so which I'll also talk about. So my connection to this story is a little odd because I'm not of this generation. I'm younger. And I was just a kid when the shootings happened. I was 10 years old, living in a small town outside Akron, Ohio. And in May 1970, the Ohio National Guard invaded my hometown. They were sent in by the governor to stamp out a Teamster strike that had gotten a little out of hand, as Teamster strikes tend to do. There was some shooting at trucks. There were things thrown off overpasses. There were brawls at the gates of the truck depots, that kind of stuff. And so the National Guard invaded this little hometown I was living in, and this had a profound effect on me. When you're a kid, you don't really process the outside world the way that adults do, obviously. But each of us at some point in our lives has that moment where suddenly you become aware of these issues and you start to have some intellectual growth and look around outside of your little kid world. And this was my moment. The shock of having these troops in my hometown pointing bayonets at my neighbors and my little league coaches. I mean, that had a real impact on me. It left a mark. I remember when the school buses drove past the guard, the bus driver made us lie down on the floor of the bus.
Wow.
And nobody ever really, talked to us about this. They just left us to process this on our own at that time. I mean, it was a different time, I think. And if you think this sounds, obnoxiously precocious, really a 10-year-old, here's proof. This is a political cartoon that I drew in 1970. My mother, God bless her, saved it, as she saved everything I did. And so you see, I mean, this thing really did leave a mark. And my first incarnation as a comics creator was actually as a political cartoonist, believe it or not. So, I mean, I trace a straight line from the impact of the Kent State shootings to becoming a high school journalist, to going to Ohio State to major in journalism, to being a political cartoonist for the school paper there, and then as a pro, and then onward and onward. So it's like this, this progression. So that's why I've always carried this story around with me. Now, it's important to remember context, and it's really hard to think about, to pull all this in because so much time has passed. But obviously in 1970, the Vietnam War was ongoing, and it had really reached kind of its depths and was just ripping the nation apart, much like, the political issues now are ripping the nation apart. But the Vietnam War was actually even worse because, of course, we were having these body bags coming home from abroad. And 1969, the year before the Kent State shootings, was one of the deadliest years of the war, something like 11,000 dead, I think.
Wow.
And 1970 wasn't shaping up to be a whole lot better. And the streets of the nation were filled with protesters, and it got increasingly violent. You had an authoritarian president, Nixon, we all remember.
Mm-hmm.
And the crackdown by the authorities was was excessive. This is actually a scene from Ohio State, which was, a lot of people don't realize was actually the anti-war violence at Ohio State was far worse than at Kent State. Kent State was actually fairly sedate up until May 1970. And then you had cities in flames. This is Cleveland. I don't know if Cincy had inner city riots off the top of my head. I can't tell you that. But Cleveland had it, Youngstown had it, Akron had it, and the National Guard was sent in all these cases. So, I mean, there were a lot of issues roiling the nation at that time. And back in Ohio, Governor James Rhodes, who was a Nixonian strongman, kept order at the point of a gun. Rhodes dispatched the National Guard to crush civil and labor unrest more than any other governor in the nation. In fact, Texas at number 2 wasn't even close.
Wow.
Ohio was also one of the few states that allowed its guardsmen to carry live ammo into civil unrest. So these kind of lax rules really opened the door to tragedy. Mm-hmm. Now Rhodes was a shrewd politician, and he was kind of an oaf of a man, but he was absolutely ruthless, and he dominated Ohio politics for nearly a quarter century. He was elected to 4 terms as governor. He sent in the Teamsters. He was trying to crush the Teamster strike because he was running for an open U.S. Senate seat, and the primary was in early May. He was trailing his opponent, one of the many Tafts who have run in one office in Ohio history, and he was desperate to make up ground. So unruly Teamsters were absolutely perfect for him to score brownie points with his base and make up that ground. Now, when you sit down and write a book, when you start a book, you have to decide, okay, what's my book about? And very early on, I decided, because there've been a lot of stuff written about Kent State. I mean, there's a couple dozen books written about Kent State. Mm-hmm. Now, the format I chose, obviously graphic narrative, is a very unusual one. So that alone is going to set me apart. And believe it or not, there has not been a lot of visual interpretations of the Kent State shootings. There was one TV movie in 1980, which is not all that great. Other than that, it's wide open. So I had his visual narrative, I had that to myself, but I needed a little more. And very early on, I decided to focus on the 4 kids who were cut down on May 4, 1970. Sandy, Bill, Allison, and Jeff. 4 very typical kids, but 4 pretty exceptional kids. And I researched them as heavily as I could. I got close to as many people who knew them, and I chart their lives through these 4 days in May. So what I'm doing is I'm putting the reader on the ground with these kids, and we walk through these 4 days. You experience what they experienced, you see what they saw. And it's my belief that when you make history personal, that's where you find the emotion and the humanity of the story. So you have Bill, who was a young ROTC cadet at Kent State from Lorain, Ohio. Just about a perfect kid. He was a Boy Scout. He played in the band. He was on the football team, the basketball team, I'm sorry. He called his mom every week. I mean, he was beloved by friends. He had the mind of a scientist and the heart of a philosopher. He wanted to be an Army psychologist and work with combat veterans suffering from PTSD.
PTSD, yeah.
Right. Then there was Sandy Scheuer, who was from Youngstown. She was the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, and she was just beloved by everyone. She worked with, she was a speech major, speech pathology, and she wanted to work with kids with speech impediments. Oh, one more thing. A friend of hers described her as wanting to save all the puppies in the world. I mean, that's the kind of girl we're talking about here. Then there was Jeff Miller, who was a young transplant from Long Island. Believe it or not, there were a lot of New Yorkers at Kent State in 1970. Kent State had recruited in New York City for some reason. They were trying to pump up their student population. Jeff was like a lot of kids, he wasn't quite sure what he wanted to do. He was just finding himself. He was creative and fun and outgoing, not a particularly serious student, very smart, but you know, he was just one of those kids who was looking for his place in the world. I mean, I was in exactly the same boat when I was 20 years old. And then there was Allison, who was from Cleveland Heights. And Allison was the youngest of the four, only 19, and she had just turned 19. But she was the most serious. She was a committed activist. She was very into politics and art and philosophy, and a very dedicated student. And then I added a fifth perspective, that of a young guardsman. I stumbled across his account and was glad to have it. And it shows the day-to-day existence that these guardsmen had over the course of this week, where they were sleeping on the ground in tents, freezing cold. You know, they had lack of sleep. They were being yanked around by these incompetent officers. I mean, they were completely inexperienced. They had no training in crowd control. They didn't know what their mission was. I mean, it was just from top to bottom, kind of a clown show of incompetence, and the result was tragic. So it really begins on April 30th. The night of April 30th, President Nixon goes on national television and stuns the country by announcing that U.S. forces had invaded neutral Cambodia, hunting the Vietnamese who were stationed there. Nixon had just a few months earlier vowed to end the war, to draw down troops there, and here he was now invading another country. The following day, campuses across the nation exploded in outrage. Remember that the Vietnam War was not fought by volunteers, as our wars ever since. Half the combat troops there were forcibly conscripted.
Mm-hmm.
You got that draft notice in the mail, and 3 months later, 2 months later, you were in the jungles in Vietnam wondering if you were going to see the next day. It was the bane of that generation, and it absolutely fueled the anti-war movement. Now, at Kent State, things began very quietly. Just a little rally on the Commons, which is the college green, and they buried a copy of the U.S. Constitution in protest, and announced that on Monday, May 4, there would be a larger anti-war rally in the same spot. But that evening, anger rose up, and a small group of SDS radicals. SDS was the Students for a Democratic Society, which was the largest student protest group in the country with over 100,000 members. Even though it had actually kind of consumed itself in the fall of '69, there were still remnants of it left. And they stirred up trouble, and there a bunch of students with a little too much beer in them went on a window smashing spree in downtown Kent. The local mayor completely flipped out, and he begged Governor Rhodes to send in the guard. And here was Rhodes. The Teamster strike had kind of petered out, and now Rhodes was presented on a silver platter with an even bigger favorite target of his base, unruly student radicals. They were kind of like the Antifa of the day. Their numbers were greatly inflated, their escapades, except, the anti-war movement, especially in fall '69, had indeed gotten violent. I mean, there were a lot of street battles and confrontations. Some of you may have seen the Netflix film, The Trial of Chicago 8. Right. Took place in '68, but the trial took place in '69. And there were huge violent protests involved with that as well. So it was no joke. The following night on Saturday, those same small band of radicals, there's only about 50 of them, but they had a lot of followers who just kind of were tagging along to see what was happening. They attacked the ROTC building on campus, ROTC being the Reserve Officer Training Corps. Right. Which is a university Pentagon-run program to train young officers. And most of the ROTC grads go straight into service in Vietnam. Something like 80% of or 90% of the officers in Vietnam either came from the service academy or out of ROTC. So it's like the Pentagon's foothold in campuses. And so ROTC buildings became huge targets everywhere, and a number of them were burned, and the radicals attacked this one at Kent State, and it went up in a fireball. And at that moment, the National Guard poured onto campus from 3 directions. And it was a pretty brutal crackdown. Now, Kent State was a campus of 21,000 students in 1970. It was the second largest university in the state. I think the 23rd largest in the country. And so in response to, a couple hundred radicals burning a ROTC building, the National Guard swept through the campus and attacked any student they found outside, which seems a little bit of an overkill. But that's how heightened, tensions were in 1970. This, however, gives me some really great scenes to draw. You have fire and night scenes, and there's some really tough drawing in this book, but I think I pulled it off. The following day, things dropped back to normal. Now the campus is under military occupation, and there are checkpoints everywhere, and tanks and jeeps, and 1,200 soldiers on campus and in the town, roadblocks. But more and less campus life returns to normal. It's this kind of weird way this story is structured, that you have this rise and fall of tensions. Each day starts out very quietly, and then, tensions rise, and there's an explosion, and it drops, and the next day you start again. But each day gets a little tenser. It's a really unusual story structure, but, that's what I was given. Now, this scene here is Sandy, just her mom pops up unexpectedly and drops off some summer clothes that Sandy had wanted. And think about what we're looking here, because this book is full of these little quiet moments, but they're just beautiful quiet moments. And this is really where you find the humanity of the story, in these moments. For example, this one, this is the last time that Sandy's mom will hug her daughter. It's the last time she'll hear the sound of her voice or smell her hair. It's staggering. If you're a parent, this is your absolute nightmare.
I think you really captured some beautiful moments with this book. It isn't just National Guardsmen and whatever.
Well, again, you have to make the story human, and that's really what I focused on doing. On Sunday night, there was a big sit-in on campus. Naturally, the students, the 21,000 students, were getting a little fed up at being ordered around. From their perspective, what did I do? I was in my dorm studying when the ROTC building went up. I had nothing to do with the riot downtown when some windows got smashed. Why am I being treated like this? So about 500 kids marched onto Main Street and had a sit-in and demanded the end to martial law. And this is a pivotal moment, because here was a chance for the Guard and the authorities to lower tensions, just kind of diffuse the whole thing. And instead they attacked. It was known as the Night of the Helicopters. And not only were the kids on the street attacked, the Guard again swept through campus. There were a number of kids who were bayoneted, up to a dozen, some seriously enough to be hospitalized. The helicopters flew through the surrounding neighborhoods around town and dropped tear gas on top of anybody they saw. It was really out of control.
Yeah.
And so the stage was set for Monday, May 4.
Right.
This is the last page in this chapter. I show this off because this is one of my favorite pages in the book.
It's really incredible.
Oh, thank you. I actually come up with this when I was down in Kent, because I went down. It's not far from where I live in Cleveland. It's about 40 minutes away. And I go down there to do sketches, just to try to. I didn't go to Kent State, so I'm an outsider.
Right.
So, I could sit down right now and draw the Ohio State campus in 1982 with probably from memory and get 95% of it right, because that was my college, but this is not. So I spent a lot of time down there doing sketches and drawings and taking reference photos. And I was actually walking down this stretch here up on the ridge there. Bill's house is in the foreground, so I was down there doing some stuff. And I was walking down here, and this scene just kind of came to me.
Yeah.
Oh, that'd be pretty cool. So that's what I drew. That's actually the Cuyahoga River there, believe it or not.
Oh, wow. No and I've read some interviews. You did quite a lot of research on this book.
It was 4 years of research, but it was 2 years of solid research before I even started drawing. And then 2 more years, you'd keep researching because at some point you have to start drawing or you're going to run out of time.
Right.
So, and then, I was doing it right up until my deadline. So yeah, it was a prodigious amount of research.
And a lot of that, I think so you're touching on this right now. A lot of that research too was just building up the visual reference to try
Sure.
to recreate this world of Kent.
Well, it's a visual medium. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly right. It's a visual medium, and also it's a very small window in time. And I've got an example of that in a little bit. I'll show you. So on Monday, the rally that I mentioned earlier started, and it was really bizarre because the College Green at Kent is kind of this bowl, and it's surrounded by hills with buildings on top of the hills. So it really kind of looks like a sports arena. I mean, it looks like a stadium or a ballpark. And there were 400 kids around the Victory Bell. There were 200 guardsmen facing off against them. And on the hillside around, there were thousands of kids just seeing what's going to happen. Because the other part of this is that the university was not closed. It was open.
Yeah.
Rhodes refused to close the university because that would be giving in to the radicals.
Right.
So the university was open, but students were banned from congregating. Well, how does that work?
Yeah.
On a campus of 21,000.
I love that you talk about this in the book, about how it's kind of set up for failure in a way.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was all about posturing and all about optics. That's all he cared about. I mean, he was not really concerned with anything other than winning his election, which is really the hardest thing to forgive. I mean, it's unforgivable, in fact. So at that point, the general in charge of the operation, who was a career desk jockey named Robert Canterbury, ordered his men to lock and load, and they attacked. Wow. They swept the commons. Now, this was right at the noon class break, and if you've ever been on a large campus at noon,
right,
you'll know what that's like.
Yeah.
I mean, it just like that, every building on campus empties as students just pour out of doorways. And the guard attacked anyone who got in their way, protester or no, and they gassed everyone. It was just it was right. Something.
And again, a lot of these people just really had nothing to do with any of this.
Nothing to do with it. No, nothing.
Yeah.
So, I show how it all unfolds. It's a bit confusing, and this is the power of my art form of graphic narrative, because you can really show things very clearly, piece together from reference material, written reports, testimonies, eyewitness accounts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can really kind of add some clarity, visual clarity anyways, to a rather confusing operation. And at some point, a small group of guardsmen from a unit called G Troop, which was part of the 107th Armored Cavalry, huddled together, and we don't know specifically what was said, but it's pretty obvious that they decided, we've had enough of this crap. Wait for the signal, and we're going to let these bastards have it.
Yeah,
and that's what they did. And they fired into a parking lot full of about 600 kids, most of whom had books in their hands and were walking from class to dorm.
Right.
67 shots over only 13 seconds, but 4 dead. Yeah. 9 shot and wounded, 3 of them critically, 2 of them crippled for life.
And you've also got a panel in the book that kind of gives some geographic context.
Yeah, well, I don't spare the violence of this scene, and
right.
That's important to show, because that's something that really hasn't been shown. Just what the effect of this fusillade was. I mean,
yeah.
It was absolutely, these are combat weapons. These are M1s, which were the standard issue weapon of World War II in Korea. Its bullet is over an inch long, copper jacketed bullet, over an inch long. And the M1 is so powerful, it can put one of those bullets clean through a foot-thick tree trunk and kill the person standing on the other side of it. It has a range of 2 miles. And this is what they shot into a parking lot full of students.
Right.
It's mind-boggling.
And a couple things I wanted to talk about there too. One is to kind of piggyback on the sort of the power of it. I think you mentioned somewhere, either in an interview or in the book, how you can still go and look on campus today, and there's a metal sculpture.
Oh, sure. Yeah. With a bullet hole in it.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
incredible.
a 1/2 inch sheet of steel and it's got a bullet hole through the middle of it.
Just yeah, just punched
Put your
right
finger
through.
in it. Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to mention to you is for people. So there's a narrative, there's a counter narrative, I should say, about self-defense, for instance,
Mm,
as a way to put it. You definitely put paid to that with one of the panels in your book where you show the distance between the guardsmen
sure. Right.
and
Yeah, it was almost the length of a football field between the guardsmen and the protesters.
right.
And there were only about 50 protesters remaining. And who are we kidding here? There are 50 kids yelling,
Yeah,
and you've got
right,
you've
right.
got 70 guardsmen with M1s and bayonets. I mean,
Yeah,
come on. There was the lone casualty on the guard side on May 4 was one sergeant who had to be taken to the hospital because he had a panic attack and fainted after the shootings.
wow.
That's it. That's the lone casualty.
Yeah,
So yeah, the narrative immediately following the shootings was that we were about to be overrun, but that's been thoroughly disproven.
hmm
Let's continue. So yeah, here's a bit about research. So I started with interviews,
okay,
and as I said, I was a journalism major at Ohio State. So this is the way I learned to tell stories. I mean, I'm not trying to be pompous here. I'm not smart enough to know another way other than how I was trained. And this is how I learned. You get close to the people who were there. So I started with anyone I could talk to who knew one of the four. So I talked to their friends, their roommates, their classmates, their compadres, and I did dozens and dozens of these things. And some of them were long, and some of them were very short.
right.
But this is where I began.
Yeah, yeah.
From there, I went into the archives. Kent State has a huge archive at their main library, which is on the top floor here, called the May 4 collection. Really a world-class archive of all kinds of material. Court testimonies, evidence reports, FBI reports, police reports, you name it.
Right, right.
Enough time has passed that all of this stuff has been released, the exception being the CIA. And believe it or not, yes, the CIA was involved. It was on campus, as it was on any campus in 1970 that had any sort of anti-war unrest. But that stuff's still classified. So we'll find out in another, I think, 15 years. I think it'll finally be released.
Yeah, one of the other characters in the book has links, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
There was an informant, student informant, who was linked to both the FBI and we think the CIA. We don't know for sure again, but we believe he was. The student newspaper was a great resource. I read a couple years of this paper because not only they chart there's a lot of backstory here, and I don't want to get bogged down by backstory, but you do have to include it.
Mm-hmm.
And no one covers a campus better than a student newspaper. And I say that proudly as a former student journalist. But it's true. And this was a really, not only just for the news stories, but also for the ads in the paper and the classified listings. It really gives you a glimpse into what is a very, very tiny window. I'm talking 4 days, 50 years ago.
Right.
I mean, it's really hard to hit that, and it can be a minefield, especially when it comes to recreating the campus.
Ah, that's great.
Again, I didn't go there, so how would I don't really, I can walk around today, but Kent State has changed a lot since 1970, as of all college campuses.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I hardly recognize Ohio State anymore. So I got a lot of period, and these things were great campus maps that came out of the freshman material that new students were given.
Right.
And it shows all the, it gives me the placement of things, and then I can track them down. And a lot of these buildings are gone. The tricky part with Kent State was that it grew so fast. In 1960, it had 6,000 students and 30 buildings.
Hmm.
1970, it had 21,000 students and over 100 buildings. I don't know of any other campus in the country that grew that fast in such a short amount of time. So it really is kind of a minefield.
Yeah,
For
but that's
example,
also that's I mean that's a really neat piece of contextual information too.
sure, yeah, oh yeah, yeah. Well, it's a visual medium, and
Yeah.
kind of the it's a little aggravating because people. I mean, I spend as much time researching the visuals as I do researching the dialogue and the narrative. And a lot of people just kind of gloss over that. It's like,
Well, that's what I
stop and look at that a little closer, please.
right. But that's so your next slide you kind of you flashed on a little bit.
Yeah,
That,
this
that's
is
what that's why I wanted to bring it up is because you didn't make this up.
none of it's
You
made
like
up. It's all sourced. Yeah,
right, right.
there's 25 pages of footnotes in the back,
Yeah,
listing the source for almost every panel
yeah.
in
Hmm.
the book.
It
So
is
yeah,
it is near exhaustive, and it's
it is exhausting or
no,
exhausting.
no, no, exhaustive, right? Exactly. No, it's wonderful because you can tell that you tried, well, you succeeded in bringing this to life for the
Yeah,
reader.
yeah, it's tricky. And this is a great example of this. This is the bar district in downtown Kent where that first window smashing spree happened.
Mhm.
Um, and this is almost completely gone. A couple of the buildings are left. Most of them are gone. And it was really tough for me to try to recreate this because again, it's that very small window in time, and these bar districts changed constantly,
Oh
sometimes
yeah,
month to month.
yeah,
So I really needed to hit that thing narrowly. And there was almost no photo reference because, it was a grungy little bar district in Kent State, and who cares?
right, right,
And
exactly.
back then, we didn't have a cell phone where we'd pull out and fire off however many photos as you want. I mean, you had to have a camera, you had to have film, you had to pay for
Hmm.
developing, processing, printing. It was
Right.
an involved and expensive process. So you weren't bothering with stuff like this.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So I used
Oh,
street
wow, look at
guides.
that.
I talked to people who worked in this district. I used a telephone book to try to recreate this street. And I would go down to the street and look across the street and see what the street number was there to try to play. I spent a month doing
Yeah. Oh, this is fantastic.
this damn map. And then I still didn't have photo reference. That was the problem. And then I found it. And I just stumbled across it. This is a YouTube video. It was a documentary made in 1971 about the shootings. And the narrator here is talking about Water Street, which is the bar district, and there it is.
Wow.
And I couldn't believe it when I stumbled across this. I'm like, oh, thank you, God. And there's the facades, there are the signs. I mean, it's bad. The quality's bad. It would be useless for everything, but it's enough for me.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I could create the same setting and get those signage in there and get the shape of the buildings. And that's,
Yeah, that's
sometimes
great.
you
Look at
just,
that.
sometimes you
Pirates
just luck
Alley.
out.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah. Now here's something that once in a while you stumble across what you can only describe as a little nugget of gold. I came across this in the May 4 collection. It was a bunch of phone messages from Sandy, or directed to Sandy, I'm sorry. And in 1970, this is how kids communicated with each other. It was the texting of the day. Obviously, there was no texting. But kids were still communicating constantly, and the way they did it was they picked up a phone and they called someplace where they knew a friend or a fellow student was going to be, and they left a message.
Hmm.
And this was to the speech center where Sandy was a speech major, remember? And so, you'd call up, say, I'd like to leave a message for Sandy Shore. There'd be a student volunteer working the message desk. They would write it down on the form like this, and then they would pin it to the message board. That's literally what message board means. It was a cork board covered with messages like this. And this is a message from Steve Drucker, who was Sandy's freshman year boyfriend. In 1970, he was also Jeff Miller's roommate. So he was an incredible interview.
Yeah.
Really key interview. A little reluctant to talk, but I managed to coax a couple, and it was just pure gold. But this little message, just a simple message, hi, how about supper at 5? A sweet message. I thought, all right. I took a picture of it to send to Drucker. I didn't know if he had it, and he didn't. But then I noticed the name, Miss Beach.
Mm-hmm.
Sandy Beach? What the hell? I asked Drucker about it. What's up with this name? And he said, oh, yeah, that was my nickname for her. Because that's what she was. She was like a sun-splashed sandy beach. And all her friends started calling that after I started calling her that. And I was like, oh, man, that's great. So I worked that into the narrative, and no one else has that. That's just because I stumbled across this phone message in a box.
So that's really, you're the only one that's uncovered that? Wow, fantastic.
Yeah. Nugget of gold.
Yeah, that's great.
So let's wrap it up by talking about process. This is actually how I write.
Wow.
These are called thumbnails. Now, they're like 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper, just regular bond paper. And I usually cut them in half, so they're even smaller. And I just do these little pages on here. This is with the dialogue worked in. It's always the dialogue and the art together. I don't think of them separately.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, I go to a tight pencil. And this is really the most labor-intensive part of the process, because this is where I spoon in all of that visual research I've done. For example, here in the bottom panel, that's Sandy walking along her street. That really is Sandy Street.
Wow.
So, I drew the houses, I drew the street, you work in the period cars and the period clothes. All of that stuff gets poured in at this stage. And then after that, on a fresh piece of paper, I use a light tablet, which has a light that shines through the bottom of it, so you can trace centrally on a clean piece of paper, and I do the inks. And then I scan it into the computer and add the finishes with a tablet and an Apple Pencil. This is where I'd add color if I was going to do color. And I didn't do color in this because I just didn't have time to do color. It would have taken another year. And, I was slamming into my deadline. So it was,
but you considered it, though, at some point. Right?
Yeah, I did. I did. At least I was going to try to do one color, perhaps. But in the end, I was going to rely on the story itself to carry the book. So
yeah,
there it is. Thumbnail. See how close it is.
Right. It's incredible to watch to see the thing come together like that.
Right. Now here's a double. Now, when I do thumbnails, I do the 2 pages on a sheet of paper, because that's how you read. When you open a book, that's what you see.
Right.
So that has to work together. And, the previous page has to flow into the page when you open, and then you have the whole scene that has to flow narratively.
Right.
It's a little tricky.
Right. Yeah,
it's
but that's
cool at this point, because, I've been making comics a long time, so I don't spend a lot of time pondering things or doing a lot of drafts. I just go with what I'm thinking in my head. But
well, you've internalized a lot of the language.
Yeah.
The language of the medium, I should say.
It's pretty much all I know. So this is the thumbnail. Now, I knew this was going to be a really dramatic scene because, again, it's fire and night. I don't have to draw in everything because I know how I'm going to draw certain things. But when you add the ink, that's when it really all comes together.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Look at that.
Yeah. So you go from thumbnail to pencil to ink.
Yeah. And
it's pretty damn close. I mean, I don't really alter a lot.
Right.
In those 3.
So you have when you set that first sketch, that first thumbnail, you've got this, the dialogue, you've got the script, you've already kind of worked out sort of the beats you're going to hit and how
I do. I usually have an outline. The dialogue I work out as I'm doing the thumbnails.
Oh, okay.
That's when I really kind of hear the voices and hear the conversations. And I mean, you can fine tune it after that, of course.
Yeah.
But that's really the process. And that's how a book comes together. I mean, it's just you've got well, this is a 280 page book, so 280 thumbnails, 280 pencils, 280 inks, 280
Yeah,
finishes.
yeah.
It's a
Um,
long, hard slog.
oh yeah, there it is.
That's basically how I put together the book.
Is is that the last panel or is that one of the last panels?
No, this is the last panel of chapter 2 when the ROTC building goes up.
Oh, right, right. Yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah.
I tend to end every chapter with a splash page, which is, one big image, just because I like showing off. And I think it's a nice dramatic way to really put
Yeah.
it.
Well, and again, it's definitely part of the language of comics for sure.
Yeah,
You don't mind me saying comics, do you?
no,
Okay, great. Some people bristle.
no,
Um,
that's what they are.
well, it is a fantastic book, and
Thank you.
honestly, all of your books are fantastic.
Well, not
And
all.
well, and what's great about them too is you can see. I wanted to talk a little bit about your journalism background because all of your books um, have this journalist way of telling a story. You weave the details in with the narrative in this really brilliant way. Um, and I know you've talked about how a lot of that comes from your time as a uh, political cartoonist, right?
More a
Yeah.
journalism student than a political cartoonist. Yeah. I
Okay. I
mean,
read some.
that's just the way I was taught to tell stories.
Yeah, I read something in an old interview where you talked about your time at your college paper, and you got into some trouble there.
Yeah, yeah. I always had a real knack of pissing people off. Yeah, and it started there, definitely, definitely.
Um, I wanted to also talk to you a little bit about, for people who don't know, excuse me, among your previous books is My Friend Dahmer.
Hmm.
And that details the very personal story of
Right.
you and noted serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer.
There it is.
Yeah, there you go. At your time in school together.
Yeah, I went to junior high and high school with
Yeah,
Jeff Dahmer. So
that
yeah, it's a very disturbing, um, sad book about a kid who spirals into madness and just kind of falls between the cracks.
yeah.
Yeah, that
It's
was my big breakthrough work
well, and
very well.
it's an incredible story. I mean,
Well, thanks.
it's amazing that amazing you were there for the beginning of it.
Right, right. Well,
And
it was one of those things that dropped from the sky and fell into my lap.
yeah, yeah,
When you're a
um,
storyteller, you can't pass up those opportunities.
right. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your experience because that was made into a movie.
Hmm.
Um, did did you have a general positive experience with
Yeah,
the
I
sort of
did. Yeah, I did actually.
kind of
It
like
was,
Hollywoodization, I guess?
I don't know that I would call anything about My Friend Dahmer positive. It was a pretty scarring experience going through all that.
Yeah,
But I was pleased with the film. I think it's very well done. I think some of the performances are amazing, and I was, sold a lot of books. And
that's a good thing.
it took the story to an audience that would not otherwise read comics, or perhaps made some new fans of comics. So it was all a positive experience for those reasons.
Yeah, yeah. I guess I was just I was afraid that a lot of creators talk
Mhm.
about how when movies get made of their creation, their writing, they feel it like kind of taken away from them. But you didn't have that experience.
Well, I think as a writer, if you okay that process, if you pass off your story to a filmmaker, you have to make peace with that.
Hmm.
You have to accept that, okay, I'm now giving it to somebody else to interpret in their way. I mean, I had many long conversations with my director before I agreed to do it, and he promised he'd be true to the book, and he was.
Yeah.
So, but at that point, you just have to kind of let it go. And as I told him, half in jest, it's like, look, man, the book's out there. It's won all these awards. It's got all these translations. I mean, you got to live up to the book. Because if you make a bad film, people will just go, well, it's not as good as the book. So I have nothing to lose.
That's a great point. Yeah.
And he got a good laugh out of that. But yeah, I mean, that's how you have to approach it.
I feel like they did do a good job with the book. It's obviously, even though comics are a visual medium, and they can be cinematic. Both things can coexist in a really nice way. Obviously, like movies not have to be, but they tend to be structured a little differently. But I think you're right. They did do a great job. They didn't take too many liberties. They stayed pretty true to the source material.
Yeah. No, it's a creepy book. What you don't know is, for those of you who have seen the film, it was actually shot in my hometown.
That's right. Yes.
The real places where that, except the high school. The high school wouldn't let us shoot, not surprisingly. Wouldn't let us shoot there. But that's actually Dahmer's boyhood home that they shot in.
Yeah. That is.
Lives there. Get this. The friend of mine who lives there and agreed to let the house be used as a film set is a guy named Chris Butler, who is also a character in Kent State. He was Jeff Miller's friend in Kent State in the book. And his account of their friendship was one of the major storylines of Kent State. So he was at Kent State, and he owns Jeffrey Miller's Jeffrey Dahmer.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah, that's
Chris Butler is. I knew him because he is a singer-songwriter.
Yeah. He was the creative force behind the Waitresses, who were a band in the early '80s who had a number of hits. Yeah, no, he's a great guy, but interesting cat, obviously. So
definitely.
It's a small town. I mean, it's just all these threads kind of come together. It's in bizarre ways.
Right. I wanted to ask you a little bit too. So we talked before we started recording. One of your first projects, you had a weekly strip, like a alternative weekly strip that was syndicated, called The City. And I that's where I first became aware of you. I lived in Chicago, and they had it in the weekly paper there. Right. I started to go through your archives though, and I was really surprised. Your early style was
different.
Very different.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, I wish I had another slideshow with examples of that, but I can talk about it without showing you anything. I did that for a long time. The City was mostly a strip that ran all through the 90s and into the 2000s, but really the 90s were its heyday, and that was kind of, the Gen X, the whole Gen X experience and all of that. It seems like so long ago, and it was. I mean, it was, it started in 1990, it's 30 years ago.
Yeah.
It ran in Cincinnati and City Beat, which I think is still around, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It ran there for years. And it ran in about, 150 of those weekly rags all around the country. So it was great while it lasted. It lasted a long time, and then it stopped. And I had to find something else to do. So, stylistically, I've always been a restless creator. If you look at my stuff at Ohio State, it looks completely different from the City, too.
Yeah.
So it's like 4 or 5 different artists, over a course of many years. That's just.
Do you mind me? Do you mind if I make a comparison?
Okay.
I was reminded of Gary Panter.
No, yeah, Gary. Yeah, I love Gary. Yeah. A lot of us were kind of working in that kind of post-punk.
Right.
Very, I don't know what you'd call it, style. We were all kind of taking the same influences, and Gary was certainly a pioneer.
Yeah.
He predates me by a good deal, but he's terrific.
Another guy, well, actually, I don't remember his name, but I know so I've read one of your early books, Punk Rock and Trailer
Hmm.
Park.
That was my
Um,
first graphic novel. Yeah, not
yeah, yeah,
early. I mean, that was 2010.
right. I'm trying to remember the guy's name, but so you've talked a lot about punk rock and its importance to you. There's a cartoonist from Punk magazine.
Oh, John Holmstrom.
Yes, yes, that's what I was trying to think of. I see a little bit of him in your work.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, sure. I used to read Punk magazine when I was at Ohio State. So yeah,
I love that stuff.
yeah, that's great stuff. All those underground publications from the 80s and into the 90s were just, you could find all kinds of inspirations there. It was
Right, right.
very different. I mean, that was before the internet, obviously. So zines and self-published magazines were the internet before the internet, and they had
Yeah,
a great
right.
influence.
Yeah. So this to kind of wrap it up. So Kent State, fantastic.
Thank you.
Just a mammoth work of art. Obviously, you've put a lot of time and energy into it. Do you have any plans for the next the next story?
Yeah, 2020 has been pretty hard to be creative. Um,
Right, right.
and I've been promoting this book pretty hard it was originally scheduled to come out in May, which
Yeah,
would have coincided with the 50th commemoration of the shootings, but it didn't come out in May for obvious reasons. And it was booted to September, and I kind of sat there in horror and watched all of the protests and reprisals unfold over the course of the summer, and thinking, oh my God, I knew this book was, I always thought this book was going to be incredibly relevant. I had no idea it would be this relevant.
yeah, yeah.
And I just thought, that's it. So, I mean, there's going to be some shooting and some guardsmen or unspecified troops are going to open fire in a crowd of protests. And, then my book becomes completely completely forgotten. I mean, I'm an author. I'm allowed to be I'm allowed to be selfish and petty about these things. But
Right, right. Yeah,
it was torture. This book's sitting in the warehouse, but it finally did come out in September, and then it was just white hot. So not just here, but abroad as well. It's sold like crazy in France, where I have a huge following.
yeah.
And the protests in France are just,
Yeah, I'm so glad. I'm so glad to see that the book is getting the recognition. I'm glad it's getting out there.
yeah, me too.
It's fantastic.
It's a big
Sure,
relief.
sure. Yeah, yeah. So,
It's nice to have it out, but it's been very difficult, of course, to promote a book this year because it's all online. I
right.
had a 40 tour book stop that went up in like a day.
Yeah, that's
So it's kind of a brave new world. So I've been working very hard on that, and that's really kind of consumed me for most of the fall.
yeah.
But
Um,
come the new year, I'll start thinking about a new project. Yeah.
right. Well, so when we had in-person events, people would come, and we got a lot of sort of we got a lot of people who would come and they would say, "Oh yeah, I want to be an author. I've got a book in me." And I always ask our authors who visit us. I always say, "Do you?" I kind of close with, "Do you have any um, final words of advice or thoughts for anybody who wants to get their own book out?" And it'd be interesting to hear your point of view because,
Oh, in comics?
yeah, yeah, because I think you're our first comics author.
Really?
Yeah.
What an honor. Um, I mean, comics are very easy to make, I mean, you pencil and a piece of paper. Now, good comics, those are hard. But comics themselves are very easy to make, and you learn by doing. You want to make comics? Make comics. Just sit down and start drawing. You don't need to have really, incredible drawing skills. I mean, you need to have some. You need to have narrative skills. But these are things you learn by doing, and it's just constantly working the craft. But if you don't start, you'll never finish. So, if you have an itch to make comics, then make them. That's my advice.
That's really good advice. Yeah, just get out there and do it. um, Derf, I want to thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Oh yeah, it was absolutely my pleasure. Thank you so much for
Sure.
being on our author visit. And the invitation is always there. Once we open up, once we have people in person, you are always welcome at our
Oh,
library.
thanks.
Come and talk to our patrons.
Sure.
And I'll also say to those of you watching and listening, thank you so much for spending time with us. This has been the Lebanon Public Library virtual author visit. Have a great day. Take care, everybody.